It's 40 years since Only You. So why is that statement so poignant? I would say that 1982 was the year I started to become aware of the music that was going through the charts. Yes, I'd watched TV programs in the UK and listened to radio, but around 1982, 11, 12, transition to senior school was when I started to become aware of what the music was that was going into the charts. It was also the year that I got my hi-fi. Christmas 2001, my parents bought me a hi-fi, for want of a better word, to replace the record player I've been using till that point. Now, it was an Amstrad hi-fi, and now we know Amstrad wasn't the best quality in the world, but at the time it was immensely better than what I had. And it was also envious of several of my mates who didn't have a hi-fi. It was the record player that I had up until that point in time was an old 60s jukebox style, where you used to load the 45s on and it used to drop them down and play them one by one. Whereas this was a hi-fi where you put the platter on and you put the needle on and away it went. This hi-fi had a slide-in, slide-out record player, supposedly to protect the records while they were being played. Not sure whether it ever did, because if the record player got knocked, the needle jumped anyway. It also had a tape deck, an FM radio, and at this point in time, a lot of the UK stations were moving over to FM from what we used to call AM, which was a sort of a frequency thing. But the thing about FM was you got a stereo signal on FM, whereas AM was a mono signal. And it also had this VU meter, which was nothing more than LED lights that flashed, but it looked really, really cool.
Remember, like, comment, subscribe to the channel. Go over to Instagram and follow me there. Go over to Facebook, follow me there. That's where the normal notices are. And consider becoming a Patreon.
So if you haven't guessed, Only You was a hit single for a band called Yazoo. And Yazoo were formed in 1981. The synth revolution was happening. And one of the early pioneers was this guy, Vince Clarke, who was a member of of Yazoo. Vince had originally formed a number of other bands. One of the notable ones was Depeche Mode, which apparently took its title from a French magazine that was around at the time. Whether it still is or not, no idea. He recorded one album with Depeche Mode during 1980-81, which spurned three singles, two of which you probably would have heard of. One was called New Life and the other one was called Just Can't Get Enough. They were the two signals that broke the top 20 in the UK. The third one sort of languished around in the 50s or 60s in the top 100. And at this point, Vince decided to leave. And it stated that he didn't like the commercial gravy train that a hit single and releasing an album actually caused. Because once you released a single, once you released an album, you were expected to go and promote it and go on shows and talk to journalists. And that really wasn't for Vince, apparently. That's the reason why he left. He had a few issues over the direction of the material that was being written for the second album. So he up sticks and left. So he was then left looking for a new vocalist for the material that he'd actually written. And the legend has it that while he was working on this new material, he spotted an advert in Melody Maker. And for those that don't know, Melody Maker in the UK was a weekly it was a full scale. It was a newspaper that was released every week in the UK. And at the back of it, it made its money by effectively putting classifieds for musicians to get in touch with other musicians to work on certain projects. And a number of really quite famous bands have been formed out of this whole Melody Maker, people responding to ads in Melody Maker and going for an audition and getting into a band, and a lot of the bands definitely in the late 70s, early 80s were definitely formed that way. Anyway, he replied to an advert that Alison had put in Melody Maker. Alison recorded the demo of Only You, which was then subsequently re-recorded properly and released in March 1982 and reached the heavy heights of number 2 in the UK chart. Unfortunately, 18 months after forming and releasing 2 studio albums, Yazoo broke up. It is said the split was acrimonious, and pretty much based on the personalities of both Vince and Alison and their age at the time. There are numerous documentaries on the life and death of Yazoo, and I'm not going to go into it now. If you want to watch them, go to YouTube, type in Yazoo. There's loads that will come up if you're interested. So why was Yazoo so pivotal to me? And it's quite subconscious, actually. It was all to do with the hypnotic riff that plays throughout Only You. It goes, Only You. It goes, dun, 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 which is really just an arpeggiation that's going on. But it plays throughout the song in one form or another. And it's the first time I really realised that music was being generated in this electronic way. And more importantly, it was the first recollection I had of being told in an interview with Vince Clarke about an item called a sequencer. Now, sequencers in 1981 are nothing like sequencers in the late 80s, early 90s when I really started playing, and the sequencers that we have now in our modern DAWs. Right? So bear in mind, this is a really early hardware sequencer that I'm talking about. Now, I was aware of keyboards, like everybody was aware of keyboards. They were starting to feature more and more with bands that we were seeing on Top of the Pops each week. Now, again, for anybody outside the UK, Top of the Pops was a weekly chart show run on the Prime BBC One channel in the UK. And it showed the movers and shakers in the chart that was published on the previous Sunday. So effectively, the chart came out on a Sunday. The producers of Top of the Pops would select acts that they wanted to appear on the show on the Thursday. They would get those acts lined up. I think they used to record it on a Wednesday evening, and it went out on a Thursday. Now, also being the 80s and me being my age that I am, I'm the MTV generation. Music video started around this point in time, and so if they couldn't get the acts and that particular song had rocketed up the charts that week, they could play the video. So this was really interesting. The other point to note here, and here is a really interesting fact. If you watch Top of the Pops, and you can get it on cable channels, and I think they show it around the world, but if you can get Top of the Pops and you watch the Top of the Pops from sort of the early 80s, what you'll notice is they've gaffer taped over the back of all the synthesizers so that you can't tell who the manufacturer is. Because typically, as you all know, on a piece of equipment, the manufacturer normally puts their name quite prominently somewhere, especially on a keyboard. It runs, along the back of the keyboard. If you look at any of the keyboards I've got big Yamaha signs, big Roland signs, big Korg signs. I'm looking down there at the Cowie. There's a big Cowie sign. There's a Boss Effect units with Boss written on them. So what they used to do is they used to put gaffer tape over the back so you couldn't see what they are. And that somehow maintained the BBC's neutrality on not promoting anything. In fact, to be honest, the BBC had a bunch of stuffy arses working for it at this point in time who wouldn't know good TV if it came up and slapped them in the arse. Anyway, I digress quite a lot. And as most of you know at this point, I didn't really get into playing keyboards until I was 18, so probably 6 or 7 years after this, is when I actually got into playing keyboards. So this is kind of me getting into the technology, and this is one of the reasons why I did get into keyboards, was because I've always been fascinated with the technology that actually is used to make music, not so much the instrument itself, although now I play keyboards, I'm very interested in the instrument as well. I'm playing the instrument. But back then I was more interested in the technology. And what's really interesting is that as I grew up and my friends started playing in bands, I was often repairing their kit and, showing them how to wire stuff up to make sure they got the maximum effect. I can remember doing a recording session with friends of mine, and we couldn't have been more than 16 at the time, and we purloined a test cam 4-track from somewhere. I don't know where we'd got it from, but we had this test cam 4-track, and we were recording. And of course, those that know, what we had effectively is we had 6 input channels on this test cam 4-track, 4 tracks to record it, and you could basically route the signal from one of the mics or one of the inputs down to one of the tracks. And it was learning how to, get the drum track down effectively with a click track, and then bouncing that drum track down to one of the tracks, and then getting the guitars down and bouncing those down, and then eventually you came up with the last track for vocals. And if you had keyboards, you were completely buggered. But you could do it. But that was one of the really interesting things. So I was really interested in technology. And Yazoo coming onto the scene was the first one where it actually resonated that you had this technology, and this technology could be used to actually generate rhythms and melodies that could be used as the point of music. You didn't have to have people playing, although you still had your guitarists and your bassists and your drummers. Part of the soundscape could be replaced now with this electronica. And one of the other things that came out of this era is that when you look back at a lot of house and dance acts that kind of followed on from this period, they go back to sort of the likes of Yazoo and Vince Clarke and say, that's the guy we were looking at when we were trying to work out what it was we were trying to do with this electronica. Because a lot of these bands couldn't play an instrument, but they knew how to program the electronica. And that's the important thing that came out of Only You, was the fact that you had this arpeggiation going on all the time throughout the song. And that was just electronic. Nobody was playing it. Maybe somebody played it in first, but nobody was playing it. It was just looped and continuously running throughout the track. And that's why Only You is pivotal to me, is because of that fact. And it was an waking up of an 11-year-old working out how this music was produced. It was many, many more years before I actually produced anything myself. But that was the dawn of the waking. And the other thing you've got to realise about this time is that there was no MIDI. Okay, MIDI wasn't ratified for another 12, 18 months after this point. Okay, so at this point there was no MIDI. Every manufacturer kind of had their own standard of how you linked your equipment together. And what was really interesting about that was you ended up with these black boxes that you had no idea what the gubbins was. There was a chip and there was some capacitors and resistors and stuff. But that effectively allowed you to link that Roland keyboard to that Yamaha drum machine or something like that, because none of this stuff was standard at the time. And it was really fascinating. This is one of the reasons why a lot of my mates used to come to me, because they would buy kit and they couldn't work out how to actually link it all together to make it work. And quite often we'd have to solder up some wires, with some adapters to make this stuff work. And RS Components had a really great mail order. I don't know where Maplin was around at the time. There was another shop called Radio Shack. You might know in the States as Radio Shack. Over here we knew it as Tandy. But you could go and buy parts in there, and then you could make leads up And I remember making lots of leads up for this stuff for mates of mine, just to make it work. You know, working out what the pinouts were on this piece, working out what the pinouts were on something else, and making the cable to fit. Now, Yazoo wasn't as effective as the band that Vince went on to form. So after Yazoo, he formed something called the Assembly, which was kind of meant to be some sort of project. It did one album. Well, I think he did one album, maybe one single with Fergal Sharkey, and then he went on to form Erasure with Andy Bell. And Andy Bell and Vince Clarke as Erasure had far more success than Yazoo had. But he still uses all the equipment that he would have used back then. I mean, he's added to it, obviously. But if you ever see, Vince now lives in upstate New York, I believe, and if you ever see his studio, it is full of Eurorack and modular and the stuff where I probably was in my early teens. But now I'd have to really sort of seriously think about how to wire this stuff up, because I'm not into Eurorack or modular. I do like my keyboards though. Anyway, on that note, I'm going to say live long and prosper. Bye bye.